So we have before us today two stories from the Bible, one from the Old Testament and one from the New Testament. And these two stories are seemingly unrelated, right? They have different characters, completely different circumstances, and they're separated in time by thousands of years. These two stories seem to have nothing to do with each other other than that they're both found in the Bible. But I think you'll find that we can learn some incredibly important lessons for our life of faith if we look at them together, side by side. The first story you heard is the story of Saul, recorded in the book of 1 Samuel. In 1 Samuel 10, the prophet Samuel anoints Saul as the very first king of Israel. And just a few verses later, Samuel gives Saul this instruction. Go down ahead of me to Gilgal. I will surely come down to you to sacrifice burnt offerings and fellowship offerings, but you must wait 7 days until I come to you and tell you what you are to do. Now, a little context here. What's happening here is that God has finally relented and given his people what they have long demanded, a king like all the other nations have. But God made one very important distinction. Israel's king was not to be an omnipotent dictator. He would not lead God's people alone. In Israel, the king and the prophet would lead God's people together. There's a very clear division of labor. Samuel, the prophet, would remain the spiritual leader of Israel, and Saul, the king, would become the military leader. Saul would be the one who would lead them into battle against God's enemies, but only after Samuel had consulted God first. Samuel would figure out what God wanted them to do, and then Saul, and only then, would lead them in actually doing it. So Saul goes down to this city, Gilgal, as instructed, and he waits. But when Samuel gets delayed, Saul becomes afraid, and he takes matters into his own hands. Rather than waiting as he's been instructed, Saul does what only Samuel is supposed to do, going against God's clearly expressed will. And you see, for that, he's judged. Thousands of years then pass in time, and we come to story number 2, recorded in Acts chapter 4. The early Christian church is in the midst of some tough circumstances also. Jesus has risen from the dead and ascended into heaven, and now they're beginning to go about proclaiming the message of the gospel. But the message of Jesus' kingdom is viewed as a threat by the current powers that be, and so these early Christians are being persecuted. Peter and John have spent some time in jail. They've been interrogated. They've been threatened. But at least for now, they have been released. And so you see in our reading, they go back to the fellowship of the church. And even though they have every reason in the world to be afraid and worried and paralyzed by everything that has happened to them, instead we find them in our reading praying with joy and confidence and boldness. And if you look carefully at that reading and what specifically they're praying for God to act. They want God to give them boldness. They want God to perform miraculous healings and other signs and wonders, I suppose, in order to authenticate the message that they're proclaiming. Now again, these two stories seem to be completely unrelated. But as I look at them side by side, I can't help but notice something. In both stories, there is cause for fear. Different causes of fear, to be sure, but reason for fear in both. Saul is afraid because of an impending battle. Peter and John have the potential for fear because of impending persecution. But in these two stories, the main characters handle their fears very, very differently. We could say it simply like this. In the face of fear, Saul takes it on, while Peter and John give it over. When Samuel fails to show up in the time frame he was expected, Saul says, in essence, well, I guess I've got to do something now. He takes matters into his own hands. But Peter and John, you see, do just the opposite. They don't take it on, they give it over to God. They don't say, well, now we've got to do something. No, they say, in essence, God, you've got to do something. We can't handle this, but we know you can, so we're giving this over to you. Now, the first choice, Saul's choice, the choice to take your fears on, that choice the Bible calls foolish. And the second choice, Peter and John's choice, the choice to give it all over to God and trust that He will handle that, that is the essence of what the Bible calls wisdom. And it seems to me, as I ponder these stories, that this is a choice that all of us are confronted with all the time. It confronts us every time we get a bad diagnosis. It confronts us when we lose a job that we love. It confronts us whenever an important relationship comes to an end. It confronts us when our children wander and do things we did not teach them to do, or even when they just grow up and leave the house and go off on their own. It confronts us every time we receive an unexpected bill that we don't know how we're going to pay. It confronts us all the time in many, many different circumstances. Over and over, circumstances arise in life that create uncertainty and cause us fear, and we have to decide in these moments, am I going to take this on, or am I going to give this over? But here's the problem. See, some of you might think, well, there you go. Just end the sermon right there. We can all get out early today, right? Just tell everyone, hey, whatever you're going through that's causing you to fear, stop taking it on yourself. Give it all over to God. Let's bow our heads and pray. Right? But that's not going to cut it today. You can't end the sermon there. And why? Because most of you in this room who are taking it on instead of giving it over to God already know that you're doing this. It's not like I've just given you some great spiritual insight here, right? No one in this room right now is wiping their brow and saying, oh, what a relief. Give it over to God. Of course, what a great idea. I've never thought of that before. No, you already know you should do that. Other people have probably told you that before, maybe many times before. The problem is that you can't do it. Or at least you think you can't because you haven't been able to do it so far. So it's not enough for me to stand before you today and preach the Nike sermon. Just do it. The real question we have to ponder is how? How were these early Christians able to do what Saul and so often we are not able to do? And you know, as I read Acts 4, I see 4 things sticking out to me, 4 other choices that you have to make first before you can choose to give it over rather than taking it on. Let me walk you through them. The first of these 4 more fundamental decisions we have to make is this one. First, we have to decide about isolation or community. You see, it's not just filler in the narrative when Acts 4 says this. On their release, Peter and John went back to their own people and reported all that the chief priests and elders had said to them. When they heard this, they raised their voices, what? Together in prayer to God. Saul didn't do that. Saul didn't do anything like that. Saul chose the path of isolation. Saul did what he thought he had to do, and he did it by himself. He didn't consult anyone else. He didn't ask for help. He just did it. But see, Peter and John were part of this extraordinary community. A community that loved each other and cared for each other and supported each other and bore each other's burdens. And one of the reasons that we so often today take our fears on rather than giving them over to God is because we have lost this communal aspect of the church. Almost without our knowledge, individualism has crept in to the modern church. And so we sit here in church together with the appearance of community, but we're not really sharing our lives or bearing each other's burdens. Oftentimes, we don't even know the people around us. We don't even know their names, much less what their fears and struggles are. No, we're a collection of individuals who happen to be in the same room together, individually hearing what God has to say to me and my life, and then taking it home to apply it to my individual life. And it's not evil, but you see, it's not what God intended for His church. If you want to learn how to give your fears over rather than taking them on, that's the first step. Do you have brothers and sisters in Christ who really know you and really know what's going on in your life? Do you have people who are able to speak words of encouragement and faith and hope into your life when yours is running low? Do you have people who remind you that you don't need to bear your burdens alone because they are with you, and more importantly, because God is with you and He will never forsake you? Because you see, if you don't have that, your default mode in the face of fear will always be to take it on rather than to give it over. So that's the first decision we have to make: isolation or community. But now there's a second, more fundamental decision you have to make if you're going to turn your fears over, and that's about your understanding of God. This is it: big God or small God? Which is to say, which one do you think you have? Do you have a big God who is able to handle anything and knows everything? Or do you pay lip service to that idea in your heart, but the truth is you really believe in some lesser deity? Notice how these early Christians prayed in the midst of these dire circumstances they were in. They didn't just pray, "Dear God, we're in a bad situation here. We need your help. Please do this. Please do that. Amen." Now, eventually, they got around to praying stuff like that. But notice, it's not how they started. This is very important. Verse 24 says they started their prayers like this: "Sovereign Lord," can we bring it up? "Sovereign Lord," they said, "you made the heaven and the earth and the sea and everything in them." Now, you have to ask yourself, why did they pray that? Was that part of the prayer for God's sake? Was God up in heaven listening to this prayer and saying, "Oh, that's right, I did make the universe, didn't I? I completely forgot about that. Thank you for the reminder"? No, of course not. God doesn't need to be reminded about anything. They prayed these words not to remind God, but to remind themselves. To remind themselves that they had a big God, not a small one. And if they had a big God who created the universe, then they had a God who could surely handle any circumstance they were dealing with, no matter how dire and hopeless it appeared to be. Now, Saul, on the other hand, believed in a small God. He didn't think he did, but he did. He could imagine a God coming through for him as long as things went the way he had planned and expected. But once the plan changed even the tiniest little bit, once Samuel got delayed and the troops started to scatter, Saul thought, well, now it's hopeless. Now it's up to me. I can't count on God anymore. Now I've got to take this on myself. Which sounds so ridiculous, doesn't it? And yet the honest truth is we all do the same thing, much more often than we'd like to admit. My friends, we have a big God. A God who made the universe with just His word. A God who sustains it every day. A God who hears every prayer we pray, no matter where we are. A God who raised Jesus Christ from the dead and who will someday raise us also. And you see, when that reality really gets into your heart and mind, you realize it's not just that I shouldn't take my fears on. I don't need to. I can give them over to Him because He is fully capable of handling absolutely anything that comes my way. See, that's the second decision you have to make. What kind of God do you have? Big God or small God? Now, here's the third primary decision we have to make. God in control or world out of control? Saul looked at his world and he saw a world that was spinning out of control. God is not doing what He needs to be doing, Saul thought. So I've got to take charge myself. But see, when you read the prayers of the early Christian church in Acts 4, you see a very different perspective. Even when their circumstances were unbearably bad, they saw a world where God was in total control. In verse 27, they pray this. They say, "Indeed, Herod and Pontius Pilate met together with the Gentiles and the people of Israel in this city to conspire against your holy servant Jesus, who you anointed." And then this. They did what your power and will had decided beforehand should happen. Now, they're talking, of course, about the death of Jesus at the cross, right? Herod and Pontius Pilate and others had conspired against Jesus, and they killed Him. And you just think for a moment of what that had to be like for the people who were praying these prayers. They had come to believe that this man Jesus they had met was actually the Son of God, that He was the Christ that God had finally sent to save them. They had seen firsthand His amazing teaching and His miracles, and then, just like that, they watched as He was tortured and brutally murdered. There had never been as hopeless a looking day as there was on Good Friday. But now, with a little bit of passage of time and some perspective, they realized that even then, when their world appeared to be spinning out of control, God was still in total control of everything. Even when they had tortured and killed Jesus, they said they realized now that those people were only doing what God's power and will had decided beforehand should happen. And see, if God was in control even then, even in the midst of those horrible circumstances, then they realized, wait a minute, then there is no circumstance where God is not in control. God is in control of everything. Even when you lose your job, even when your marriage ends, even when your children mess up, even when your finances are a disaster, even when you get diagnosed with cancer, even when absolutely everything looks hopeless. God is in control of everything. He always is. But that's the third decision you have to make if you want to give your fears over to God. Is this world spinning out of control, or is He actually in control of everything, no matter what? Now, there's one more choice you have to make, and it's this one: your agenda or God's agenda. See, Saul, he didn't even consider what God might be doing. If you read his response to Samuel's criticism, the one word that keeps popping up over and over and over is the word I. Well, I thought this, and I saw that, and I felt this, so I decided that, and on he goes. He just knew what he wanted. That was it. But you see, one of the most amazing things about the prayer of these early Christians is that in the midst of these terrible circumstances, even as they faced certain persecution, they did not pray for what they would most obviously want. They never prayed for protection. Did you notice that? They didn't pray, God, please don't let anyone hurt us. Don't let anything bad happen to us. That's what we would probably pray for, but it's not what they prayed for. We would have prayed something like, Lord, consider their threats and make it all stop right now. But here's what they prayed, verse 29. Lord, consider their threats and enable your servants to speak your word with great boldness. That gives me chills to read that prayer. That is an astounding prayer. Because you see, they didn't pray for God to change their circumstances. They prayed that God would change them. And one of the primary reasons that we take our fears on rather than giving them over to God is because we are absolutely consumed with our agenda to the point that we don't even think about what God's agenda might be. So, my friends, let me remind you of something about God's agenda today. Something that you're not going to want to hear, but something that you absolutely need to hear and take to heart, and it's this. Fixing all your bad circumstances is not God's primary agenda. God's primary agenda is fixing you. Because all your circumstances, good and bad, are all going to end, but you're not. And sometimes bad circumstances are necessary for us to rediscover the community of the church and how much we actually do need each other. Sometimes bad circumstances are necessary for us to remember that we do, in fact, have a big God who is able to control everything no matter what happens to us. And sometimes bad circumstances are necessary for us to remember that our lives are not our own. And that God's agenda is the only thing that should really matter to us. See, no matter who you are, no matter what you're going through, no matter what you're afraid of, you don't need to take it on yourself. And again, it's not just that you shouldn't, you don't need to. You can give it over to God and find the peace and hope and strength and courage that only He can give. Let's bow our heads and pray.